Hello and welcome. Thank you all for attending to the 2021 International Conference on Security. My name is Zulema. I am an intern in the ICRP, and thank you all for coming and for attending for this conference. My topic is Terrorism in North Macedonia, Causes, Rehabilitation and Best Practices. I chose to do a regional aspect of a global issue because it's easier to see, but I want to mention that it's important to know that these recommendations that we are going to see and these ideas that we are going to study can be found in other regions. So it's an international problem. For this reason, everything that we are going to see can be applied, and it's also understood and researched from global aspects of the topic of violent extremism. To begin with, I would like to define violent extremism, that according to Mogadam is terrorism is defined as politically motivated violence perpetrated by individuals, groups or state-sponsored agents intended to instill feelings of terror and helplessness in a population in order to influence decision-making and to change behavior. We are going to look at some of the literature. We can see that before 2017 the literature is found to be lacking. There were only generalized views, and the literature focused mainly on Islamist radicalization, leaving other forms of violent extremism in the dark. But between the period of 2017 to late 2018, 60 or so publications have emerged that have covered some gaps of the previous literature. In order to understand what leads to terrorism in the Balkans, I looked at the literature, and we see that some studies, such as Sabani and Kadri, suggest that it's important to look at the kind of extracurricular activities that the students have. Not only education and not only poverty lead to terrorism, according to these authors. Others suggest, in contrast, that education matters a great deal, but that the important part is the quality of education, not the level of education achieved. Petrovic and Kehaya suggest social alienation as a factor leading to violent extremism. Sonia Stojanovic-Gajic suggests that the heterogeneity of some areas where there are a lot of different identities is not the issue. Rather, how the heterogeneity is played by identity politics and by the political elite, which often exacerbates inter-ethnic tension. Then we have the Islamization of the region in post-1990s conflicts, when more conservative forms of Islam were introduced. And lastly, we have that some students went to study in the Gulf, and they returned back home as more conservative or radical. In this slide, we can see how the national counterterrorism strategy of the government of North Macedonia is informed by the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy and the European Union Counterterrorism Strategy. North Macedonia tries and implements the ideas of the United Nations and the European Union for dealing with terrorism. In order to understand what leads to violent extremism, we have different models that we can have a look at, and that explain what leads to terrorism. There is the Staircase to Terrorism by Mogadam, Radical Islam Ideology, Radicalization Factors, and Mechanism of Political Radicalization. The Staircase to Terrorism, it's a model invented by Mogadam. It's a psychological analysis which envisions terrorism as the final act in a 5-level staircase. On the first floor is where the vast majority of people is, in which they are conscious of the injustice they live with. On the second floor will be people trying to seek ways to improve their situation. Individuals who reach the second floor experience great unfairness and anger, which is often weaponized by leaders towards a common enemy. On the third floor, there is individuals who begin to agree with the morality of terrorist organizations and begin to see terrorism as justified. On the fourth floor is where recruitment begins. And in the fifth floor, we have individuals who start to participate in terrorist attacks and who are trained to overcome inhibitory mechanisms that would impede them from attacking others or ending their lives. The ideology of radical Islam presents terrorism as a necessary part of faith. It is followed by a minority and has nothing to do with conventional Islam. This ideology suggests that the Islamic community is under threat by a global conspiracy led by the West and actors that follow Western premises. From this belief follows the need to fight for the faith and the community, namely the jihad. It exploits anger. All kinds of actions against Muslims are presented as deliberate attacks by an omnipresent enemy, and is supported by Islamic propaganda that is especially graphic and proposes ways to counter the Western threat, namely terrorism or traveling to war zones. Radicalization factors. In this aspect, we can say that analyses such as Moghadam's staircase to terrorism follow a linear explanation of a process that rarely is linear. For this reason, some authors speak of radicalization factors. There are socioeconomic factors. A majority of people who commit terrorist acts is middle class, but there were also some with previous charges such as theft or drugs. The common characteristic is that there is a big unemployment rate that is bigger than the national rate. So we can say unemployment is a big factor. But these factors, these socioeconomic factors, are not central in explaining radicalization. There is also religious factor, but the studies suggest that it is not a factor of radicalization. Rather, it offers little explanatory potential, and various studies suggest that religious education prevents radicalization. The majority of terrorists came from a background where religion played a secondary role, if at all. Their relationship with religion was rather superficial before they entered into contact with radical imams, propagandistic videos, and online debates. Religion can be the means to pass the message, but it isn't the radicalization reason. Psychological factors. Even though there are cases in which mental health play a role, it isn't relevant enough as to consider it a factor of radicalization. Demographic factors suggest that it's not only young people and not only men who commit terrorist attacks. Attacks are often the result of a cultural shock and the perception of discrimination that help create identities opposed to the home society. Islamic radicalism offers an alternative identity and encourages a sense of belonging to individuals who are often discriminated against and who don't feel part of the home society. Still, there were terrorists that were integrated into society. Existential factors. More often than not, individuals recall a point in their lives when they were disappointed and unhappy. Authors agree in that there is a point of inflection in which individuals ask themselves their role in society through a personal crisis that opens them to options and ideas that they had not previously considered. Islamism exploits all types of unhappiness, something that attracts all those that feel marginalized by an individualist system. Among some reasons to join foreign wars were seeking status, identity, and belonging, as well as a way to let frustrations and anger out. These frustrations don't find other ways of expression and end up being the means of radicalization. The mechanism of political radicalization by Macaulay and Moskalenko suggests that radicalization as a process emerging more from the dynamics of intergroup conflict than from individual psychology, as opposed to other theories that tend to individualize, pathologize, and depoliticize the problem. These authors propose 12 mechanisms of radicalization that don't individualize the problem, but because they are fighting the pathologization and the politicization of the problem. These groups are divided in three big groups. We have individual radicalization, group radicalization, and mass radicalization. In individual radicalization, there is by personal victimization, by political grievance, by the slippery slope, in which an individual progresses into a terrorist group slowly and gradually, slowly increasing radical behavior, in which new beliefs are adopted in order to make sense of bad or incongruent behavior, and radicalization by love or proximity, Individuals are recruited to a terrorist group via personal connections with existing terrorists, with whom they develop relationship of camaraderie and devotion. Love might increase due to common goals and threats, increasing group cohesion. In group radicalization, we have like-minded groups. Groups of strangers brought together to discuss saw a shift towards extremity. Discussion with individuals with similar values produces internalized shift towards more extreme options. By isolation and threat, individuals isolated from external groups derive their identity and values from the terrorist cell. The value of the group is maximized, and the group's consensus about value and morality acquires enormous power, including the power to justify and even require violence against those who threaten the group. Group radicalization in competition for the same base of supporters, group radicalization in competition with state power. If an illegal rally is repressed by the state, a small number of highly committed individuals can form a highly radicalized group, and group radicalization in competition for status within the group. In mass radicalization, we have mass radicalization in conflict with an outgroup. Some terrorists have explicitly sought to elicit a state response that will carry far beyond the terrorist to strike terrorist sympathizers to action. The outgroup threat leads to higher coercion and other terrorists to attack. Mass radicalization in conflict with an outgroup, exploiting the emotion of hate to dehumanize enemies that are seen as sharing the same bad essence and therefore subject to no longer be seen as human, making sense of the impulse to attack without regard for age, gender, or civilian status, and martyrdom, the perception that people who have killed themselves for a terrorist attack knew what they were doing when giving their life up for the cause, and so serving as a self-explanatory example. The terrorism in North Macedonia, the recent cases, have consisted of the Skopje government attack in 2014, which consisted of the throwing of 2 grenades to the Macedonian government building. It is attributed to extremist right-wing terrorists. The Gosinje attack in 2015 consisted in the attack by 40 right-wing armed men to the body police station in Gosinje, near the Kosovo border. They tied and beat the policemen and stole radios and other assets and issued a message before leaving. The Kumanovo shootings, again by an extremist right-wing organization, left 8 policemen and 10 terrorists dead and several wounded. In this camp, we see that the strategies for countering violent extremism in North Macedonia are as follows. We have the national strategy of the Republic of Macedonia for countering violent extremism, adopted by North Macedonia's parliament in 2018, but the impact and implementation are mostly analyzed by civil society organizations supported by international donors instead of government institutions. So the government is still not dealing properly with the extremism, because a lot of the weight is put on civil society organizations that, as we are going to see, don't have still a lot of power to deal with terrorism. Then they created the National Committee for the Prevention of Violent Extremism and the Fight Against Terrorism, which leads the initiatives to implement the action plans with representatives from 22 institutions that act as liaisons and manage the implementation of activities planned in the national strategy action plans. The National Committee promotes interinstitutional cooperation to counter and prevent violent extremism in line with the recommendations of the European Union, the United States, and the United Nations. According to the plan, civil society, which is formed by NGOs, religious leaders, local communities, youth, media, and women, have an additional role to play. Public policies and programs, they put a bigger focus in the judiciary and disregard the preventive measures. It works by the revamping of existing laws to better address the problem of foreign fighters and violent extremism. The little research is mainly focused on the judiciary and is conducted by CCOs. Then we have civil society organizations. CCOs were not initially accepted by state institutions as relevant actors in preventing violent extremism, up until the adoption of the National Strategy of 2018, but the number of CCOs working on the issue is still limited. And religious communities. The Islamic Community of Macedonia is the official Islamic religious community and is active in countering violent groups. The project's strategy is to strengthen moderate attitudes by raising public awareness and reaching out to the Muslim community. They also work on the resocialization of former foreign fighters. They believe that strengthening the religious voice that transmits the true message of Islam to Muslims in Macedonia should be the first and foremost urgent intervention. The state is not cooperating with them and it does not receive funding. And in order to deal with the issue of violent extremism in the Balkans, in North Macedonia and in the world, we can see some recommendations by international studies done in the region and in other areas of the world. It's important to create other voices in the form of internet campaigns or through research to increase the number of counter-narratives, to increase the power of counter-narratives. It's also important to organize agency-specific and specialized trainings for relevant agencies and institutions. It's important to include gender dimension and include feminine role models. We have to facilitate interfaith and multi-confessional dialogue platforms to discover new ways of engagement. It's important to increase the resilience of the society to avoid the economic and social problems that are sometimes at the root of violent extremism. It's important to reach terminological consensus and access to data for researchers who often face significant struggle. For example, data is classified. We need to give bigger power and financing to organizations working in countering terrorism. Most local institutions are restricted in their interactions by their mother institutions at the central level and do not give legitimacy to requests from other institutions, resulting in action taken only when requested by the mother institution or other central authorities. We need to coordinate efforts of the local, national and international organizations. Apply a conflict sensitivity lens. Understand that local dynamics and sensitivities around interethnic, religious and political divisions that cause tensions and mistrust, as well as the need for trust building between citizens and institutions such as law enforcement. Prioritize human rights to avoid inadvertent stigmatization of or infringement of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Avoid overly securitized approaches and encourage people-centered approaches that take into consideration communities, not allowing overly securitized approaches to break the ties with those communities. In conclusion, it's important to increase the number of counter-narratives. The number of CCOs working on this issue is still limited. We need to organize trainings. It is needed to give bigger power and financing to organizations working in countering terrorism. It's important to facilitate interfaith and multi-confessional dialogue platforms to discover new ways of engagement. It's important to cover research gaps, increase the resilience of the society, such as unemployment and social problems, include the gender dimension and feminine role models, avoid the stigmatization of communities, and have more interconnected organizations that can collaborate with each other. Avoid overlapping of activities and hierarchies.